Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Lasaniziris, and this is my YouTube channel grecochess. We're going to continue covering the 80th chessanity tournament that took place on Friday, July 11th, with the second round. Let us show first the announcement of the tournament. July 11th, Sayos at New York, which is in Long Island. And the time control for the quad section, I was participating in the quad section. Let me explain once again. 4 people participate in every such section, depending on their ratings. And since I had the second best rating, I was placed in the quad group number 1. I had to face the other 3 top rated players. And the time control, as you see here where I'm putting the arrow, is D40, D5, which means that players start with 40 minutes. And when it's their turn to move, for the first 5 seconds, the clock does not move. And after that, it's going downwards. And players need to complete all their moves before the clock goes down to 0. My second round opponent asked me not to reveal their identity. And that's why this person is only going to be referred as my opponent. And let us go now to the analysis board of chess.com and follow the game, see what happened. Once again, to the left, you'll see the chessboard, and to the right here, you're going to see the computer evaluation. Positive number means white is better. Negative number means that black is better. Computer is going to say whether a particular move is the best or not, and if not, which would have been the best. My opponent had white, I had black. Opponent starts with the e-pawn, and I reply with the defense. The e7 pawn goes to e6. My opponent continues developing the d-pawn, and I reply the standard way, the pawn from d7 to d5. And now my opponent plays what is called the select variation. You can see it hopefully here, with the bishop going to d3. Knight goes to f6 is my reply. Not the best possible move. Ideally, the computer would like me to have used my d-pawn to take on e4. But mine is still a book move. My opponent pushes the pawn to e5. And usually in the past, I would move my knight to d7, but many times this would give a lot of space to my opponent, so I push my knight back to g8 so I can go later to e7. Computer thinks that I ideally should have placed my knight on d7, not on g8. Knight goes to e2, and I reply with my pawn going to c5. Just to tell you, while I'm showing the moves, that I had a much better rating than my opponent. Not going to be more explicit because my opponent requested anonymity, but in theory, I was supposed to be the favorite. I push my pawn to c5 to give myself some space. Opponent replies the c pawn go to c3. I develop my knight to c6. My opponent pushes the pawn to a3. And now my queen goes to b6. The whole story is control of the d4 square. That is why pawn, knight, and queen attack the d4, and my opponent replies the pawn and the knight. And my opponent pushes the bishop back to c2, so I attack it 3 times, the pawn d4, and this defended 3 times. I develop my bishop to d7, and my opponent castles. You see, little by little, my opponent started building a small advantage, approximately +1. As I mentioned before, I now develop my knight to e7. The computer thinks it's not a good move. Inaccuracy. The computer would rather have me push the pawn to f6. The reason I did not do it, I was very reluctant, although in the French defense, that's a frequent move, is because I didn't want my e6 to be backward, at least not before I completed developing. My opponent pushes the b pawn to b4. I take the d4 pawn. My opponent takes it. I had at some point to take it, otherwise, with the two pawns attacking b4 and d4 attack my c5. If my opponent took it, they would have a wonderful stable pawn at c5. And I move my rook to c8. The C file is open in the sense there are no pawns there, although there are other pieces, and I wanted my rook to occupy this file. My opponent places his bishop on b2, which is an inaccuracy, and you'll see later I had opportunities to exploit it, meaning if the pawn at b4 was not here, my queen could easily take the bishop at b2. When I goes to g6, inaccuracy. For the next few moves, I'm going to miss the chance to place my pawn to a5. Why would that have been great? Because my opponent cannot take it, otherwise they lose the bishop, and I'm attacking the b4 pawn 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and it's defended only once. I would have won at least a pawn had I moved my pawn to a5. Neither me nor my opponent saw this opportunity. My opponent pushes his pawn to f4. The moment my opponent did this, I started thinking about the pawn at d4 that's now pinned. My bishop goes to e7, develop also my bishop. My opponent develops the b1 knight to d2. All the time, I have the chances with the pawn from a7 to a5. I miss it repeatedly. I didn't think about it. I castle. Another miss, another chance I could have moved my pawn to a5. Now the knight goes to b3. Now this is really the best because I don't have this option any longer. My queen goes to c7. Computer thinks I could still have pushed my pawn to a5. But it would not have been so simple like before. The knight goes to c5. And my knight goes to b8. I want to threaten the knight at c5. My opponent places the rook to c1, and now I get rid of this knight. It's not a good idea to have a knight at the opponent's knight at your half of the board. It controls quite a lot of crucial squares. So I'm willing to sacrifice my bishop for that. Bishop goes to b5. The computer thinks I should instead have pushed my pawn to f5. Once again, I was afraid of the e6 pawn being a backward. But what happens in chess is many times there are exceptions to the rules. My opponent will push the pawn to f5. I take with my pawn. Pawn takes the bishop, and now my rook is threatened. This is why I push my bishop back to d7. My opponent places his bishop back to d3, and my knight goes to c6. I'm hoping I can somehow win one of these 3 pawns. Knight goes to c3 for white. Bishop goes to e6 and protecting the pawn at d5. Knight goes to b5 and threatens the queen. Queen goes to d7. And knight goes to d6. Now my opponent has the knight at the best possible location. at the sixth rank at the middle of the board and threatens my rook. Fortunately, my other rook is still on f8, otherwise it would have been f4. Now I'm able to protect my rook, placing to d8. Queen goes to b3, and the pawn at b7 is attacked twice, with the knight and the queen defended only with a queen. So I push the pawn. My opponent takes it. And now the computer thinks that this was inaccuracy. Usually you don't want a pawn from the center to take pawns towards the edge. And now the natural move was to retaliate, take the pawn, use my f7 pawn, take it back. The computer would rather have the rook take it. Of course, the pawn now cannot go to a7 because the queen is lost, and I'm threatening to take the pawn with my rook and attack the queen. But unfortunately, I played the obvious move. Getting behind more and more. 2.06 is the advantage of my opponent. Bishop goes to b5, and now I'm in a very bad situation because my knight is attacked twice, defended once. If I try to use my rook on c8, I lose it because of the knight. If I try to remove the knight, I lose my queen. And after thinking, I found an answer that at least saved me from becoming worse. Knight goes to a5, as I say, danger level, so while my queen is attacked, my opponent's queen is also attacked. My opponent saves the queen by placing it on b4, which the computer thinks a mistake, and now my opponent's advantage becomes much smaller. My queen goes to e7, I'm saving my queen. My opponent places the queen on a4, and my queen goes to g5. As you see, little by little, my opponent's advantage becomes smaller. And my opponent places the queen to d1. The computer thinks it's an inaccuracy, and believe it or not, I'm now ahead, even though by only 0.17, I'm now slightly better. My knight goes to f4 and threatens with mate. But this is a mistake, because you also need to think, what is your opponent going to do? And my opponent reacted by placing the queen to f3, knight attacked twice, defended once. And here I didn't know how exactly to continue. And I decided to play a move that I thought would put me in a very good situation. I placed my bishop on h3. The computer thinks a blunder, but what I saw then is that if the queen takes a knight, I have checkmate. I have a lot of threats in this position. The bishop can easily take the pawn at g2 and then have a discover check. But the computer thinks it's a blunder and raises my opponent's advantage suddenly from almost equal to plus 4.03. And we're going to see why it's a mistake, because my opponent replied with a good move. Not the second best move, but still good enough. The rook goes to c2. And now what do I do? Everything is threatened. My knight is attacked twice, defended once. Where can I put my knight? I don't have mating threats any longer. I realized things were not going so nice, so I decided to minimize the damage and take rook and a pawn for 2 pieces. Knight goes to g2. Rook goes to g2. I take the rook. Queen takes it. I realized I was behind. I didn't realize it was so much, but I knew that better not exchange queens because otherwise my opponent has quite an advantage. So instead, I check with my queen. Goes to e3. King goes to h1. Queen goes to b3 and attacks the two bishops, but both are defended. The one with the knight and the other with the queen. But I was thinking that if my opponent allowed me, I would use my rook to take the knight, lose the rook, and then take the bishop. My opponent decides to threaten with checkmate. Rook goes to g1. The computer thinks it's an inaccuracy, assuming, of course, I would see it, and yes, I saw it. Pawn goes to g6, and queen goes to e2. At this point, my opponent's advantage became smaller once again, 2.80. We reached the 5-minute part of the game, which means that we had less than 5 minutes, and from now on, we didn't need to keep notes. In fact, we shouldn't, because this takes valuable time. But what happened later is that my opponent was able to have a finale where he was slightly better with two very crucial connected pass pawns, the D and the E. I was able to take back the pawn thanks to an intermediate move with a check. And just when I started hoping, my opponent, with seconds ago, when the last minute, threatened both to take my rook and a checkmate. And with very little time, I only saw the threat to the rook. I touched my rook to save it. Then I saw there was also the mating threat, but it was too late. I had to move the rook. I placed to a square that would only postpone the mate. Then I tried to postpone even more by placing my queen to support the rook, but then my opponent placed a bishop, pinning my queen, and my queen would be lost. At that point, I resigned. And therefore, after 2 rounds, I have 1 win and 1 loss. But let's do the review of the game. See how did we do. Low accuracy, 76.9 for my opponent, 73.3 for me. And the computer thinks that my opponent played for 1850 and I played for 1750. Not a bad rating for me. It's about 200 points higher than my actual one, but I'm not very happy at all about this game. And let's see how things went. My opponent had two great moves. I had none. 14 versus 10, best for my opponent. Excellent 4 versus 1 for me. Good, 5 good moves each of us. My opponent had 4 good moves. I had 3. Inaccuracies. I had 7, my opponent 5. Mistakes, 4 for my opponent, 3 for me. Misses. And most of them had to deal with the A5 potential pawn move that I didn't see. 4 I had to my opponent. And blunders, it says none. Even though my taking of the h3 pawn on a bishop was described as blunder before. Congratulations to my opponent. He won the game. And now we are going towards the third and last round. What happened that round? How did I end of the tournament? We're going to see at the next video. In the meantime, thanks again to the organizers. In addition to making the tournament reality, they had ready the chessboards and the clocks. Chessanity has this huge advantage that exists in very few other tournaments, where players don't have to worry about bringing their own sets and setting the clocks correctly. Everything is done by the organizers. And of course, thanks to you, the viewers, to the subscribers, to the people that like the videos, and to the people that left some nice comments. We'll see you later with the third and last round of the Chessanity tournament. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Harry Lasaniziris. This is the grecochess YouTube channel. Goodbye.